Today, I'm going to be doing something a little different because my talk will be entirely in VS Code. Woo! So, like she said, I'm Lee, and I work at Vercel, and I lead the Next.js community. If you haven't heard of Next.js, it's a React framework. And we recently released something called the Next.js App Router. Has anyone heard of the App Router? OK, that's more hands than I expected. That's awesome. So for those who haven't, what I'm going to be walking through today is a demo of what the App Router looks like. So the premise of this talk is called Next.js Metamorphosis. And the name for that is because Next.js has evolved a lot over the years. It was originally released in 2016, and it had a certain way of building. And I'm going to talk about the journey through a real application of how we landed on the App Router today. So what I have here is my editor on the left running a Next.js application, and then my browser. And the first thing we're going to start off with is the core of Next.js, which is routing. When we released Next.js in 2016, we said we love file system-based routing. We want to make it as easy as possible for you to get started. Just drop a file in a folder, and it will create a new route. So I have pages/index.tsx here. So if I do export default function home page, and I say return React Summit, and save, and then in the browser, let's go to localhost 3000, we see React Summit. So this is all it takes to get your first route up and available on your local server or in production. And this is what Next.js was built on 6 years ago. Now, what we're going to be building today is kind of an internal app dashboard that shows a list of invoices. It's got some settings pages that have some layouts. And we'll get into more some of the advantages of some of the new things we've been using. So let's start scaffolding out this page a little bit more. So rather than returning a string here, let's return some layout component. And we'll see if my VS Code is not giving me my helpful autocompletes, but that's OK. We can manually type things out. That's fine. We'll do import layout from components. And I have two different layouts for my application. We have a home layout, so we'll use that one here. There we go. OK, so we have a nav bar that's going to be shared throughout our application, and then we have my invoices. So this is kind of the shell of our home page. Now, inside of here, we also want to have some components and display some UI. So let's do some cards that are going to display some statistics about our account, maybe how much money is in our account, what the invoices are, and then we'll also do, oh, there we go. It's coming back. It's trying to help me out a little bit here. Component/table. Let me just manually import the card as well, too. Import card from components card. I scaffolded out some UI components for us to use ahead of time. Cards. OK, cool. So we have some cards that don't have any data right now. And then we have a table with some static data. So the core of Next.js is built on React, allows you to compose components. But very frequently, you need to actually fetch some remote data and pass it to your components. So the first API that Next.js released to do this back in 2016 was called get initial props. So let's use that to actually fetch some data and put it on the page. So I'll say homepage.get initial props. And this is going to be an async function that we want to fetch some data from. So we'll do const data equals await get card data. And then we're going to return that data to the page. So let's see. Nope, I'll type it out myself. Because oh, there we go. OK, from our library, from our database, I'm going to import this function, get card data. That's going to return some JSON here. We're going to return that data from this function. And that gets forwarded to our React component. So inside of our React component, I have props. So I can destructure out data here. And we'll just throw on some any type here. Gotta love that. And then down below on our cards component, we can forward along that data by passing props. So I'll do data here, and I'll hit save. We have data on our page. Woo! Love it. So this works, and we're able to fetch remote data, but it does come with some trade-offs or some things that maybe are not obvious. So this runs on the server, but it also runs on page transitions. So this first API left some room for improvement for us to clarify how you would actually import and use these functions for fetching remote data. So the metamorphosis of this, the next evolution of this API, was breaking this into two separate APIs. So export, async, function, get, server-side props, and okay, cool. Copilot's gonna help me out today. We'll see if that works. So this is basically the same thing structure-wise. You have an async function that's gonna return an object. In this case, there's a key for props. So if I hit save, it also forwards the data along to the page. But the difference is that this is explicitly marked as get server side. So it makes it a little bit more clear to developers, hey, this is running on the server side, and it's forwarding that information over to components. Now, the counter to this, or the pair to this, is get static props. So you get the option whether you want to choose, do I want my data to be fresh on every request, or do I want to pre-render this during the build and potentially incrementally update it later? Now, let's talk about some of the potential areas for improvement with this. Let's say our API is slow. And to simulate this, I'll just throw on a 2-second delay here into get card data. And you see our browser loading spinner spin and spin and spin and spin. Now, when you're doing this top-down data loading, you have all or nothing data fetching for your page. Either you have all of your data or you have none of it. So maybe to make this a little bit more dramatic, I'll go to about blank, and then I'll go back to localhost, and you see this is what your users are seeing. This is what your customers are seeing, a loading spinner and potentially a blank page. That's not a great experience. Ideally, we could show some kind of visual indication to our viewers, whether that's maybe something like a loading state on the components. That would be kind of nice. Now, unfortunately, one of the areas for improvement here is that it's not easy to declaratively define your loading state next to your component. Ideally, this card component knows about the data it needs, it knows how to load, and it knows how to define its fallback or the loading state that we're showing here. Now, the way this would work in the pages router of Next.js is that you often had to change your strategy of fetching data. So instead of fetching data on the server, if I wanted to have this co-location of data, UI, loading states, I would need to fetch data on the client side or just normal React in the browser. And that works, but it can also cause some other trade-offs as well, too. So there's some opportunities for improvement here that we're going to talk about in the app router. But we'll pause on this page, and we'll move to another page. So in our application, we have our home page with some invoices, some cards, and a table. But we also have some settings page that look slightly different and have a different layout. So let's actually build out those. So let me do an export default function settings page. And we're going to return some layout here. This is going to be import layout from settings layout. And I have I don't need to have all those paths. See if that works. Test. Yes. It could be I don't remember if it's the default or named export. Let's see if that works. Yes. Woo. OK, so we have the same nav bar that's shared across our application. And then we have a slightly different settings page layout here that has this top bar, but also this sub-navigation for our page. So we're going to have two different pages here. We're going to have a profile page for settings and a display settings page. Now, inside of here, let's do a form. So we're going to show how to actually submit some data here. And we're going to do this by scaffolding out a name component. Let's do maybe well, let's see if this works. Name, no, OK. Bio. These are just going to be inputs that we can use in our application. Maybe a button. Yes, OK. And maybe this button is going to take in some children because we can just forward along that child to our component. And we'll say this is going to be something like update profile, for example. Will it auto do it? Nope, it won't. OK. Import name bio components. I actually don't remember what the path is here. What is it? Component Is it in settings layout? It probably is. It's better when it automatically gives you the import. That helps a little bit. Let's see. Cards, minimal, navbar. Where is it? Settings layout. Yeah, it's in the settings layout. My editor just doesn't want to update. Okay, let's see if that works. It works, okay. One day VS Code will help me out more here. So I have a name input, I have a bio input, I have just a normal button that takes in some child, and I want to actually submit this form. Now, the way most of you have been building Next.js or React applications is that you use an event handler to do this. So let's go to our form and let's say, you know what, on submit, we want to call some function handle submit. And because I would absolutely fat finger this, I'm going to drop in a snippet for this one because it's a lot of code. And we'll see how we can delete some of this code here in a second. We have a function, handle submit, that takes in the event handler. We're going to not reload the page. We're going to get the values from the inputs. And then we're going to call an API route in Next.js. So this API route allows us to write some backend code, expose an API if we'd like. We have API submit here. That forwards the body of our two inputs, and then it basically just echoes out or returns those values. So I actually went ahead and set up this API ahead of time. It's basically just console logging out the values on the server. So let me close this. I'll save here, and let me just pull this up here. And let's say I want to change this to React Summit. I'll hit Update Profile, and on the bottom left here, you can see in my console output on the server, we see the name and the bio from our API route logging out the information. So this is pretty typical. You need to have this code running on the server so that you can securely connect to your database or pass along an environment variable that has a secret key. You wouldn't want to have this run in the browser and expose those values. Now, this works, but it does come with some trade-offs. Notably, that this requires client-side JavaScript to run, so the progressive enhancement story could be better. And also, as you can tell, there's a little bit of ceremony code here. That would be the nice way of putting it. There's a lot of extra code that you need to write, and we're going to see some ways that we can reduce a lot of that code and also simplify the mental model, hopefully, a little bit as well, too. Now, while we're here, I also want to talk about that layout. You notice I've been importing this component that has the layout for our application. Well, what about when I want to have another page that uses the same layout? I actually won't write this one out fully because it's pretty small. But if I want to have this display page that's also in the settings, we're going to use, let me just close this here. So pages/settings/display, we're going to use that same layout. And it's going to take in a component I'm going to call minimal mode. So let's take a look at what this looks like. I'll click over to display. We have this component called minimal mode that allows you to toggle how much data we want to show in our invoice table. Now, what you would love to do is reuse, that's the great power of React, reuse that table component, the same table component that we used on the home page. So this works. We can input it here, but this comes with another opportunity for improvement. Right now, this table data, if I actually jump into this file, this is not asynchronous. This is static data, which means that I'm able to actually do this. But if all of the sudden this was instead data equals data and I needed to forward in some data from a remote location, that would mean that this page would need to have some kind of data loading function, a get server-side props. The index page would need to have that same data loading function. Everywhere you would consume that component would need to pass that data and serialize it from server to client. It would be great if we could co-locate our data fetching with our components. So now that we've got this scaffolding of our application across the index route and the settings route, let's take a look at how we can make some of these things a little bit smoother. So what I'm going to do is actually go to our index route. I'll just copy paste all this code. And then I'm going to go to this brand new app directory. And I have a new subfolder and then a new file, page. So page is this special convention that marks a piece of UI that's routable. So I'm going to paste in our code previously. And let's start deleting code. That sounds fun. So let's take this promise. We want to go fetch some card data. We'll keep this. But what if we removed the Next.js specific API? What if we removed the forwarding of props to serialize this in between here, and instead we just said, you know what? This is an asynchronous function, and we're going to fetch some data in it. Well, that seems pretty simple, doesn't it? So let me hit save here, and then I'll go to localhost 3000/new, and we see the, let me reload the page here. Oh, I had the loading state. It threw me through a loop there. I was like, is it loading? We see the exact same thing that we saw before, which is we have data displayed in our cards. Now, for the good eye here, you might be wondering, why are there two nav bars? And the reason for that is because that state is actually shared between all of the routes. That layout is the global piece throughout our application. Now, luckily, in the app router, there's a new way or a new convention that allows you to define your layouts through the file system. So the root layout for our application, it's importing our global styles, and it's using that nav bar, which is the part that's actually shared throughout the application. So what that means is that this layout can actually be the part that's only shared for the home page. So you know what? Let's get rid of this nav bar. We don't need that anymore. Okay. So that streamlined that down a little bit. But what about that problem I mentioned about if the data is slow? Does that still exist? And the answer is yes. That problem still exists because now you have the flexibility and the optionality to choose how you want to handle this. So let's say, you know what? We actually want to stream in data out of order. This card UI, we know that this API or this database call might be a little bit slow. We don't want to block the rendering of the page while waiting for this data to come in. Instead, we want to present the user with a loading state. So you know what? Let's actually remove this, and let's remove this. We'll remove this. We'll remove this too. And we're going to do the data fetching co-located with our cards component. So I'll pop in here, and let's mark this as an asynchronous function. This is a React server component. And then I'll say, you know what? If we pass the slow prop of true, then we're going to fetch our card data, and we're going to have this delay here. So now, back inside our main index route, let's declaratively define what we want the loading state to look like. So I'm going to take this, and we're going to wrap it in React suspense. And we're going to throw the slow prop on here. And then we're going to define a fallback state of how we want loading to look like. And that's going to be cards loading. So I'll hit save here. And now, when I reload the page, actually for dramatic effect is fun. I'll go to about blank, localhost new. We instantly see the UI. The data that's slow gets to stream in out of order, and it gets to be co-located with the component. So you keep the data close to where the UI is actually being rendered. That's a big improvement. I think that's much nicer to work with. So that's one problem down. I'll try to go fast here. The second one is the profile page or the settings page. Let me just go back to here. I'll copy paste this code over into the new page. And let's look at how we can refactor this from the previous way to a new way in the app router. So as I mentioned, one of the opportunities for improvement is there's a lot of ceremony code. What if we didn't have to make a fetch to a separate API? And what if instead we could run this component entirely on the server as a server component? Well, we wouldn't be able to use an event handler. We need something new. And with the introduction of React Server Actions and the integration into Next.js App Router with the caching and revalidating layer, we made it so that you can do something like this. I want to have an action on my form, and actually I'm going to denote this button as a type of submit because it's just using the HTML form here. And it's just using a button with type submit. And this action is going to take a function. This could be like save to DB or something. Now, instead, what we can do here, let's just get rid of this entirely, actually, because we don't need an event handler. We're going to have an async function save to DB. Copilot is very wrong here. It needs to learn how this works still. And it's going to take in, not from data, but form data, which uses the web form data here. And this function is going to run on the server. So the way that we denote this as a server action is through the use server directive. If I can type, there we go. And then we can get the data from form data, the name and the bio. And then let's just console log these out here. That looks right to me. OK, new /settings/profile. But whoa, what is going on here? We have layouts inception. What is this? Well, like we showed on the homepage, there's an opportunity to improve how we handle layouts. So I mentioned there was a piece of our layout that was shared between the homepage and the settings pages. Let's actually refactor that into the file system layouts. And to do that, you see we have a new nested layout in the app router. And this is taking in that settings layout component that's shared between the two routes. So we've actually moved that state up, and critically, this component will not re-render. So if we wanted to have state in here, when we transition between pages, like a toggle or something, that would not get reset. Now, that's not in the demo, but it's just good to know. So if I go back into here, I actually don't need this at all because it's been lifted up to the layout file, so I can remove that entirely. And we're making progress, but we still have the double nav bar, so we want to go into here and say, you know what, for the settings layout, we don't need this anymore. Boom, goodbye, see you later, double nav bar. Okay, that's looking good. Now, the moment of truth. Does this simplified function, this server action where I just call a function directly, I don't have to make a separate API route, does this work? I hope so. It does! Woo! Awesome. I don't know about y'all, but that code looks a lot more fun to write to me. So that's definitely an improvement there. The last thing I'll touch on before we go into QA is just to mention that the display page and our settings page can also take advantage of lifting up and reusing the shared layout between the two routes. And because the app router is built on React server components, we could now co-locate data with UI. If we wanted this table, for example, if we wanted to say, you know what, actually, this is going to be an asynchronous function. We're going to await getting some data. This is going to run and cache that data, cache that fetch as static by default, which means that this works whether you deploy to a Node.js server, you deploy to somewhere like Vercel, or you even export it as a set of HTML and JavaScript files, because this can be cached and pre-rendered during the build. Now, let's say you want to take advantage of some server features. Maybe we want this list of invoices, and it doesn't update too often, maybe update every 60 seconds. Well, we can still cache that to static data by default, but then maybe we say, you know what, export const revalidate 60 seconds. So we want this route segment or this component to update every 60 seconds. That's all it takes for us to periodically update that data at most every 60 seconds. So I know I blew through a lot of things here. There's a lot more that I could cover, even getting into talking about how client components work. For example, maybe this minimal mode toggle, we wanted to have some state. I'll just quickly show that as well too, since I'm right here. Let's say we wanted to have data and set data or something. We want to have use state, something like this in our minimal mode for this toggle. Well, this is going to show an error. Well, can't find use state. That makes sense. But let me actually import it here. And now, what we want to do here to actually be able to use state, well, we would say, you know what? To have an interactive component on the client side, we have a much more clear boundary between what runs on the server and what runs on the client. So we're going to explicitly mark this with the use client directive to say that this component has access to using any React hook in the ecosystem, built-in hooks like use state or use effect. So now, hopefully, the code is more clear which code has the ability to also run on the client and which code runs only on the server. So this was a whirlwind run-through of the app router. Hopefully this gave you a better overview of some of the new features that we're working on in Next.js. The final hat trick here is that this all works in the same Next.js application. All of the APIs that we worked on and used from day one, get initial props, everything that we've built from the start, this can all coexist in one application and harmoniously live together. So you can keep your pages router, which is working great in production today, and then incrementally adopt the app router as yourself or your team is ready and try out some of these new things. So thank you all for listening to my talk, and I appreciate it.